Welcome everybody to a joint, quasi-joint, whatever the four, joint committee meeting. We have today around the table in the audience, watching from home, the House Education Committee, the Senate Education Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. All here to hear a presentation on foundation formulas when it comes to funding education. We have representatives here from the administration, from the Agency of Education, to walk us through a consultant's report that they received that sort of outlines foundation formulas, what they mean in today's context. Many of us sort of remember the old days of Vermont when we operated under a foundation formula. They have evolved over time into something a little more complex, a little different. I think what we're going to do is we'll have the presentation, then we'll move to questions. Because we've got a large group of folks here, we will do questions kind of back and forth, House, Senate, House, Senate, House, Senate. Get everybody who has a question to be able to ask it. And then for those who had already asked a question, we'll get a second. We'll then go back to that. Sounds okay to everybody? Great. I'm going to just turn it over now to our guests to introduce themselves and proceed with their presentation. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thanks for having us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Jill Briggs-Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner.
And we're joined also by Justin Silverstein and Amanda Brown from APA Consulting. And then before they get started on their presentation, I'll just provide a little bit of context and framing for this discussion. So in the governor's inaugural address, he signaled a very strong commitment to strengthening public education. Part of that is thinking about how we fund education to ensure educational quality, equity, and sustainability. So as the Agency of Education, we've partnered with APA Consultant to help us in exploring approaches that will allow us to achieve those goals. We know that the term foundation formula comes with a lot of questions. We've presented versions of this presentation to the Commission on the Future of Public Education to be able to provide an update on really the evolution of school finance and school funding over the last several years. The other piece of this that will be important to talk about, we know that we have to talk about the Brigham decision when we talk about funding schools in Vermont. And so as we're looking at this, we see the Brigham decision as a floor. We know that any funding formula will need to meet that compliance with the Brigham decision, which is really about taxpayer capacity. What we're proposing is really going beyond taxpayer capacity and talking about ensuring that students with similar needs get similar resources, irrespective of where they live across the state of Vermont. Since the governor's address, I know there's been a lot of questions around what does this mean and what does this funding formula represent? I know there's been some concern about this being a voucher system. And I want to be very clear that that is not what this is. We are bringing forward an idea for a foundation formula that is about strengthening our public education system. And there's a lot of policy choices along the way to ensuring that we can all as a state achieve our collective goals. When we think about funding, it's important to also talk about how that relates to educational delivery and educational quality. All of those things are inextricably linked. And it also, funding is about how we prioritize our limited investments to support educational opportunities for students. So you'll hear a lot in our conversation around best practices and how we can think about prioritizing our investments in ways that are going to support student outcomes. Today, the presentation is really walking you through a definition of foundation formulas, looking at how other states approach this work. And those are all things that we'll need to talk about within the Vermont context. After the presentation, we're excited to hear your questions and considerations and think it'll be important to continue to have that dialogue. This type of a change to a funding formula will require a lot of engagement with stakeholders and ensuring that we're factoring in important considerations to ensure that we meet those intended goals of educational quality, equity, and overall sustainability of our system. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin Silverstein to begin the presentation.
Thank you. I can look past Jill yet, so it's there. Great. Thank you all for the opportunity to come talk to you today about foundation formulas. Again, I'm Justin Silverstein, co-CEO of, we just go by APA Consulting. We're a Denver-based education policy consulting firm who's been doing school finance for over 40 years all across the country. I have with me Amanda Brown. I'll walk through our presentation and then we'll both be here we'll be able to answer questions. We want to start off our presentation really thinking about, or just laying out a couple key school finance terms that might come up as we discuss this, but really have also been important in the development of foundation formulas over the past few decades. And so when we think of school finance, and if you think of school finance kind of review and case law and everything else, equity has, for over 50 years really been the big concept that folks have talked about. It originally started with really horizontal equity, where folks were saying, well, does every student just get the same amount of money? Really base level theory of action with equity. That changed a little bit to, well, do students in similar circumstances get the same money, the same amount of resources? And that was kind of horizontal equity. As a sector, we've really moved more towards vertical equity when we think about how are students impacted. And that's really trying to ensure that students with higher needs have additional resources to meet their educational standards set for them and receive a similar educational opportunity. And so those student needs tend to be students who are special education or from economically disadvantaged homes or who are English language learners. And then we also think about differences in district needs, and we'll go deeper into what those specifics might be. But really what you're trying to do is address differences where they exist to ensure students have similar educational opportunity. And then of course, all of this though really gets played into with taxpayer equity. And at its base level, when we think about this at APA and a lot of other school finance experts, what we're really trying to ensure is that for similar effort, a taxpayer can assume they'll get similar resources for their students in their community. And that kind of theory of action bleeds in pretty quickly or leads to fiscal neutrality. And so as we come into any state and are thinking about, how well is the system working, we don't want to be able to look at a community and allow that, the characteristics of the community for us to be able to predict the resources available for a kid in that community. So we don't want to have a strong link between the wealth and especially property wealth of a community and the overall level of resource available for those students. That fiscal neutrality really means, there isn't that direct link. And then one of the really big shifts in the past about 30 years in school finance has been to talk more about adequacy. So absolutely keeping a focus on equity, but also thinking about what are the levels of resources needed to ensure all students can meet state standards. And where this came about is that in the late 90s, we had something called standards-based reform come about. States started to set the expectations of what students should learn through standards. They then created tests to measure how well those students were meeting those standards. And then they often created accountability systems that held, and at this point really are holding students, teachers, schools, and districts accountable for those outcomes. And so folks said in the late 90s, early 2000s, well, if we know what we want students to learn, we can measure how well they're doing that. We're holding them accountable. Can we also ask the question of what does it take to get that done at a resource level? So that's really what adequacy is. The next piece we want to talk about, another really kind of framing slide, comes back to just comments that were even made as we kicked off. We're going to talk about a foundation formula that has a meaning in Vermont that really was both about kind of how much and who paid for the dollars in the system. When we think about a school funding formula in a state, we really think about two separate pieces. We think of first the formula, that is identifying the amount of resources needed in a district for those students to have the opportunity to meet state standards and have that educational opportunity. And that formula really is thinking through the student and district characteristic differences place to place as it generates that targeted amount of funding. And then the state comes in and thinks about, now that we know what each community needs, how do we pay for that? Those two pieces have been combined in Vermont for a while now. Right? We really, because we don't have a clear step one, and instead really are looking at tax capacity, those two pieces have come together. And it all comes together in, state funding, which we understand, a large percentage of that state funding coming from property taxes through that ed spend. So why have some states gone about changing their formulas? I think the real, focus here has been on creating a system in the state that has similar educational opportunity for all students, and then designing a funding system that allows that to happen. So again, you want to have your educational priorities leading and a funding system that's supporting. The formulas really attempt then to become more student-based or student-centric and target funding to those groups that I mentioned: special ed, economically disadvantaged, and EL students, and then adjustments for what are district cost drivers that are beyond the district's control. So what are the different types of formulas that are used across the country? We turn to the 2024 Education Commission of the States analysis of how each state is funding their students. And really, again, this is that first piece. So how is each state determining the amount of money or the amount of resources they think is needed in each district? 36 of the 50 states use a foundation formula. Just so you know, if you go to the Education Commission of the State's work, they are now calling that a student-based formula. They no longer call them foundation formulas. They're the same thing. In your region, New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut all use some form of a foundation formula. Just so you know, they will all look a little different, sometimes very different. And then some states who've recently changed to a pretty traditional foundation formula include Tennessee, Nevada, and Maryland. There are 9 states who use a resource-based model. Most of those states are in the South. That model really, at its base level, looks at number of students and sets a number of ratios to fund those students. So, for example, if the state thinks there should be 25 students for every 1 elementary teacher, and your district has 100 elementary teachers, the state is going to fund 4 elementary teachers. They are going to have ratios for principals, and they're going to have ratios for counselors and all those things. But they're going to build this up through a resource-based model. Most of those states, though, then still allow districts to spend those dollars how they see fit. So they don't actually send 4 elementary teachers to the district. They fund 4 elementary teachers. The district might decide to do something else. There are 4 states who use a hybrid approach. Regionally, that includes Massachusetts and Maine. And then Vermont is one of the 2 others. Wisconsin is the other state, I believe, in that other bucket. And you both have systems that are kind of more tax focused than kind of resource focused. And so Wisconsin's approach is a guaranteed tax-based model. So what are the components of a foundation formula? And so on this slide, we're really showing the components of an overall funding system. Again, determining, and then with the left side being the main components of a foundation formula. The vast majority of funds, or at least the majority of funds in most states in a foundation formula, come from the base funding. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means, but it's basically the same amount per pupil for every student in the state. You then apply student weights to those categories we talked about, and then district weights or adjustments based on those uncontrollable district costs. What's also included in the funding system, right? So you have a foundation formula, you're determining how much, the state's then determining who pays for that. You're also going to have funding for federal funds coming in. Those are mostly for specific student needs, including your Title I, your special education funding, your English learner funding. You're going to have state level categorical and grant funding. And then states have to make a decision of, do they allow additional local funding to be raised above that foundation formula? So a little bit more kind of the definitions within that foundation formula. Again, the first and really the biggest, most, could kind of be considered the most important piece of the whole formula is that base amount. And that base amount really should be developed to represent the resources needed for a student who has no identifiable special needs. So they're not special education, they're not EL, they're not an economically disadvantaged home in a district with no additional cost drivers. Because you're going to set that base and then you're going to make adjustments for all those other types of needs. And so again, those main student characteristic adjustments that we've talked about already are the economically disadvantaged, English learner, and special ed. And then the most common district characteristic adjustments really are district size and or school size adjustments. Those tend to be also especially the school size adjustments focused on what we would refer to as necessarily small schools or necessarily small settings. And then 13 states make some sort of adjustment for either cost of living or cost of doing business of a district. And then this is the piece, the second piece is the how do you fund the foundation formula? Want to be clear, Vermont is a state funding for its students. So this won't be perfectly applicable, but we can talk about kind of how it relates. Most states, again, set that foundation amount for every district. They then look at really a taxpayer equity lens. And what they look at is, again, a common rate for every taxpayer in the state to participate in the state's formula. Districts who have a low property wealth per pupil are going to get more state dollars and have to raise less local dollars. Inversely, high property wealth communities pay a higher share and get less of those dollars from the state. But I think the key piece here is that foundation formulas tend to have a big focus, even on the payment side, on that taxpayer equity. And again, ensuring similar effort for the participation in the formula and ensuring that similar students across the state are receiving similar resources. So kind of leaning into the Vermont context, you have a long history, even before Act 127, of having some student-based weights and some other weights in the system. So you've already been, really thinking through kind of that weighting approach and understanding it. Again, it's more about tax capacity than it is about actual funding. And so that's where the difference lies. A foundation formula is going to say a student in the Northeast Kingdom who's an English language learner or a similar student around Burlington, they need the same amount of total resources to be served. Your current approach provides a tax capacity, but you could very easily see those same two students have very different resources available to them. So foundation formulas are more targeting what is needed, less about that tax capacity. Again, state is fully funded, so we're not concerned about the state local match, but are very concerned about taxpayer equity. And your current system does adjust for that equity in local tax rates, in part in relation to the community's decisions on how much to spend per weighted pupil. So you have that piece in there. And the system currently does allow for variation in spending through those local decisions. And that's how you can get to some of those differences in what is being spent on similar students across the state. So to implement a foundation formula in Vermont, a couple of things that we're thinking through here, again, those Act 127 weights relatively recently put in. It's a good history for weighted funding. What we think is really important, though, is that those weights currently are not built on top of a base amount. So it's an amount, it's their weight, so 1.03 for free price lunch, a 2.49 for English learners, but it's not multiplied against anything. It's just creating a long-term weighted ADM to really think about capacity and funding. And so we think it would be important to set that base and then to look at the weights once you've set a base. There are a couple approaches that have been developed to set a base in states. Probably not surprising, the most common approach is to do the math, multiply everything out, figure out how much money there is to spend, and then determine the base amount through that calculation. Kind of a best practice approach, though, is to use one of these different adequacy approaches that have been developed over the past 30 years to really think about what are the resources necessary for students to get that educational opportunity you want for them in Vermont. The state actually had one of those approaches done recently by Picus Auden Associates. It's an evidence-based approach. We understand some of the concerns with that work and not quite mapped to all the kind of Vermont context yet, but it is a good starting point. It is one of the approaches that has been accepted by state legislatures and even courts across the country as a basis for funding. It's currently used in both Wyoming and Arkansas as the basis for their funding systems. That evidence-based approach is one of two approaches that we call input-based approaches. And what's nice about those approaches, the other is the professional judgment approach, is that they build up to that base cost by identifying specific resources. So if you've seen the Picus Auden report, it will say that it expects one teacher for every 15 students in K through 3 and one teacher for every 25 students in 4 through 12, and it identifies system principles and everything else. Evidence-based and professional judgment do that pretty much the same way, a little different approach, but again, you know what's kind of under the hood. The state also has experience with one of the output-based approaches. It's called the cost function approach. The other is the successful schools. Cost function approach is using really high-level statistical analysis to understand the relationships between resources needed and different student characteristics and different district characteristics. It can develop a base and the weights. Right now in your state, it's really been focused more on the weights and some of the weights that are in Act 127. It doesn't tell you as much about what's under the hood, like what is in those weights, what is it kind of purchasing, what are the resources it's purchasing. And then the last slide, you have a system that does allow for variation right now. I think as you build any system, thinking through variation, thinking through all the decisions, it just has to be in that context of Brigham and really understanding how that plays together. And we are good for questions, so I can. Oh.
Okay.
Justin, do you want to stop there? Perfect.
Great, thank you. Okay, a lot there. So let's open it up to questions, being with the Senate side. Senator Chittenden, please.
Thank you, Justin. On slide 4, you mentioned you lumped Vermont in with Wisconsin. I understand from my travels here in Montpelier, to some extent, how we got to where we are. Do you have any additional context to put around how Wisconsin came to a similar type funding mechanism as Vermont, how long they've been there, and what their rationale or motivations to adopt a similar approach?
Senator, I do not, their approach has been around for a long time. I do not believe it was driven from any sort of court decision. We're happy, though, to dig a little deeper into their guaranteed tax-based decision.
Thank you.
House members? Are ping-ponging back and forth? Yes, Representative Higley.
Out of those other 48 states that have a foundation formula, has there or is there any consideration for school choice, whether it's within the state public school systems or outside of, that independent schools?
Yes, Representative. Many states, and I don't want to say most, but I think it would be most states have some form of school choice in their systems. And so absolutely found the 36 states who use a foundation formula. I can name a couple examples, but even our home state in Colorado has a foundation formula, has a lot of school choice. Their school choice is both inter-district and intra-district. So it's not a constraining factor on choice. And so it allows for it in both ways.
Thank you.
Senator Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am happy to talk to you about Wisconsin. I actually was the school finance analyst in Wisconsin when Wisconsin changed its funding formula and implemented the new formula. So I have a lot of history about why they did it. But the basic answer, Senator, is that they had high property taxes, and the state was attempting to supplement with state general funds in order to reduce their property taxes. And that's why they got to a tax-based formula. But again, I'm happy, I could do a whole presentation on that. But I have a couple of questions. I'm just curious. Well, I have a bunch of questions. I wish you were here in person, Justin.
Next week.
Next week? Okay, well, maybe we can have lunch so I can go over all of my questions with you. I'm curious about, you mentioned our weights. Our weights are, you're absolutely correct. They're not calculated based on a foundation formula. And when we did all of the work to create the new weights, that was made very clear that they are a different type of calculation. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process for recalculating weights if we were to move to a foundation formula.
Absolutely. And I'll start, but Amanda, please come in. She's kind of our whiz on kind of all things calculating. Many states, as you try to identify new weights, if you're coming in and really building a system that's related to resource need, you're doing much like you would do in even something like the evidence base. You are identifying the services and resources needed for specific students to meet those goals. So you might be looking at Are you going to have after school programming for your free reduced price lunch students? Are you going to have smaller class sizes? What are the types of services you need for English language learners? I would say that work has been done in a lot of states, both through adequacy studies and through just formula creation. So there's a lot of work to pick from and build off of, including work that's already been done in your state. Dr. Colby's work done, I think, in January of 2020 it's now last year, looking at kind of the resources needed for EL. And even in some of what I've read, and I could be reading it incorrectly, and so I always know I don't always have the full context in a state, so please, others who do, there was an identification of both kind of almost a total amount of funding in the identification of your 1.03 weight for free reduced price lunch students. It talks about both I think it was around $10,600 would be the additional funding for the free reduced price lunch student. And that was built on kind of an implied weight underneath that. So again, a lot of work to build off of both nationally and even what's been done in the past couple of years in Vermont.
Okay, I would love to get a lot more detail on that and look at the math, because Commissioner Bolio knows I love to do math in public. Could you talk a little bit more about what do you mean by professional judgment approach? What is that? I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, so the professional judgment approach, it's actually an approach that we at our firm use quite a bit. If you've had the chance to read the Picus-Auden approach, it's taking a very similar theory of action. And so it actually starts with some of the evidence-based resources. It then has review panels at the school level, special needs level, and district level of in-state practitioners to review those resources and adjust for the state context. And at the end, it's doing very much what the evidence base has done. It's taking all those resources and creating a base and weights from that. And so again, theory of action, and just so folks know, just full transparency, we work pretty closely with Picus-Auden in a lot of states. And so we've run both of those in Michigan, Maryland, and most recently in Colorado. And you can kind of then map differences between what the research can tell you. And I think Larry and Alan are very good about really focusing on what that research is. And I think we'll also tell you there are things that the research hasn't yet caught that could be important in a system. And you just don't have the studies yet to say it's statistically significant need. And so if you look at our Colorado report, which just became public a couple weeks ago, or Maryland or Michigan, you'll see some places where that evidence base tends to be adjusted up a little bit to meet some of those kind of state context issues through the professional judgment.
Okay, if I may, like one more. I have a lot more questions, but just one more for now. On your slide on funding a foundation formula, it seems to imply that the funding has to be property taxes as revenue, and I don't think that's the case. I'm not sure you meant that you could use any kind of revenue source. Obviously, what we as the state does, we use taxes and fees as our revenue source, but it's not a foundation formula is not dependent on using property taxes as the revenue source, correct?
No, I think a number of states have used, so clear answer, no, you do not have to use property taxes, I think, and that's a great way to talk about that differential, right? The first part is to figure out what is needed. The second part is figure out how to pay for it. So absolutely, you could have a different piece. States, and if you've worked in Wisconsin and other places, right, property taxes tend to be a little bit more stable over time than some other tax streams. And so the vast majority of states use property tax as some part of the system, but to your point, it doesn't have to be all the system, and it could be none of the system if you could find other revenues.
Okay, great. I just want that clarified. Thank you. Look forward to talking to you more.
Awesome.
Bridget?
Just a question. Out of those 36 states that use a foundation formula, how many of them have a statewide teacher contract? And for those that don't, how do they manage disparities in teacher salaries and benefits across the state?
So we will need to take a look at that. My understanding is statewide teacher contracts actually are more frequently in those resource-based states. So those states who calculate the need based on resource. And in part, that is because the state is literally paying for that teacher. So you would basically, again, if we have those 4 elementary teachers, the district would kind of send in their 4 most expensive teachers. They would be plotted against that statewide salary schedule. And then that's part of how the funding comes back across. We've had this come up one other time, so we'll take a dive pretty quickly into other states. My understanding, there are not many states who have a statewide salary schedule. And so the variation in what's paid in part is local decisions on, well, we might pay more and have higher class sizes, or we might want to pay a little less so that we can have lower class sizes, or maybe more support, right? So it is local decisions in order to balance that. But I do completely understand also the need to be thoughtful about, like, how do you ensure a level of quality of pay for staff anywhere in the state.
Thank you.
Other hands? I'll just ask, one thing that you didn't talk about this is as a tool to save money. And I assume that was very intentional, that this is just a different way of funding our school system. Many of us have received a strong message from the people of Vermont that property taxes at least are too high, but you're not out promoting a foundation formula, or perhaps this is more a question for the administration, as necessarily a way to save money, but more as a way to tax and spend differently. Is that a fair statement?
So I can respond to that. As I said in the beginning, we've had 3 guiding principles that have helped to focus our efforts. One is promoting better educational opportunities, increase educational equity, and also have sustainability. So there is some efficiency and effectiveness that we need to think about within our system to ensure that we have that sustainability moving forward. But it's really important for us as we approach this work, particularly from the Agency of Education's perspective, is that we're focused on quality. And so we're in a position, and we've talked about this a lot, where what's good for the taxpayer is also good for the student in many areas. And so as we're looking at this approach, we will also be talking about, funding, quality, and delivery. We know right now that many of our districts are very hamstringed in terms of their ability to fund the array of programming that they would like to. And so we do need to have broader conversations around how do we support sustainability of the system to make it operate at the scale that would allow for districts to provide that consistent level of programming and opportunity for students. So the focus is educational quality, and when we become more efficient and we're operating at the right scale, there will also be a reduction in overall spending we would expect.
I think there's also, just to point out, with a shift to a foundation formula in other states, it also makes changes to the budget cycle. And so we can sort of lay that out in additional presentations, but it's in essence the reverse of how we currently budget. So the districts would know, based on a series of inputs in the foundation formula, what their, I'll just air quote and say, allocation is well up front. Then they would be able to develop their budgets with quite a lot of sort of flexibility and control within that allocation. And then that would also be able to move our budget timeline later. So right now we budget early, we start early and end early before a lot of the sort of data inputs are sort of finalized. This actually shifts the budget cycle later when those data inputs and sort of strategic planning can take place. And so that is another aspect of switching to a foundation formula, is you're actually switching the budget cycle as well. And then I think the other key difference, so there's predictability, and the other key difference is that in most states, there isn't a vote on the budget. The input to the budget happens in the development of the budget within that allocation. And so that's where that engagement takes place. Within this allocation, what are we going to prioritize to meet our strategic goals and support students? And that's where that input happens. So that's, I'm sort of describing broadly, this is how it functions in most states.
Speaking of stability, is there traditionally with a foundation formula an expectation of one legislature can never bind the next legislature under any circumstances, but it's an expectation that, like, it's there's at least a CPI increase year to year or something like that, or something that districts can then at least begin to rely on as they're putting together the budget for the next.
Absolutely. And that's something that we would need to consider is what are those policy mechanisms? We've looked at what other states have done in terms of a point of reference. And Justin, if you want to expand on some of what those mechanisms are that can be supportive of those annual adjustments, maybe.
No, thank you. Absolutely. Different states are doing this differently across the 36. I would say, especially in the states who've recently done this, most states have a target of some sort of approach year to year, a CPI adjustment, some sort of other local inflation adjustment. I would say the majority of states, though, have put in some sort of circuit breaker to that to also recognize constraints of economic conditions. And so trying to understand that balance. But you're absolutely right. Most of these are written with some sort of lens. And what's nice about the foundation formula is you really only have to adjust that base amount every year for the whole system to then be adjusted.
Representative Kornheiser.
To follow up on Senator Bongart's question. So if a foundation formula has inflation adjustments, some sort of regular recalculation to sort of true up with the evidence base, what mechanisms have other states used in order to maintain integrity of the funding that's related to either an evidence-based or whatever that field reflected word was that I don't remember, in the face of political headwinds and economic headwinds?
So I think there's two pieces of that. I think there are states who have found ways to, if there is a cut, track what that has been. So if the goal, let's say, was a 3% adjustment for inflation and the state could afford 2%, so they track the difference in that percentage. So I think that's one approach. Again, I think every state is slightly different here. And in part, it really determines where you want to, if you have to make an adjustment to what the formula would say, where you want to do it. Some states just do it from the base. And of course, that flows through every single part of the formula. Some states only take a look at those your student or district adjustments, so you can make adjustments there. It really is a policy decision. And outside of something being in the Constitution, it does come down to the legislature year to year to make those decisions. But we are doing a data review or literature review on how every state does this. And so we'll have that, we have some of that information put together.
I don't know if this would come up naturally in a literature review, because I'm asking to, I'm talking about actually protecting the base more than protecting the inflation. I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns from the field about doing something like this. And, we cannot tie future legislatures, but we can create incentives to protect ourselves from ourselves.
And Amanda, build on this one. If what Arkansas has done with their implementation of the evidence-based approach is, I believe every year, but at least it's every 2 years, their legislative staff actually, to your point, recosts out that base amount, but both applying new salary figures, but also taking a look at kind of any changes to expectations for students or kind of national best practice in some of those categories, right? So you could think, 20 years from now, we might do something different with guidance counselors than we do today. So you could also set up a regularly phased in approach, which again you can't tie the hands of a future legislature, but it would have an approach to say, this is what it should be based on this, systematic approach to thinking about what the base, how often we review the base and how we review that base.
And Wyoming is another example of a state that has that regular cadence for what they call recalibration of their base.
Yeah. And then for the states who are more recently implementing, Nevada has put together an actual, can't remember if it's a commission or just a committee, but they have a group who's overseeing the implementation over a window of time. At this point, there is no thought of actually getting rid of them. Like there is no time where they're grandfathered out or sunsetted. And Maryland actually created a whole new entity called their implementation board, who is working to think about implementation and does two things. Trying to make sure there's fidelity to that implementation, but also being able to look at did we get something a little wrong? And how do we adjust that to make sure it works as we go forward? So those are the other things some states who've done recent changes are doing.
Representative Wozniak.
Thank you. First is a request. If we could see some of the other pupil and district weights that other states use. Just there might be something in there that we have not, that the legislature has not thought of yet that might be useful. And then the second one is, could you speak a little bit more on the 4 states that use a hybrid model? Just what that looks like. What do you mean by, you spoke a little about it earlier, but you could go a little bit more into detail.
Well, and if I could interrupt, I say especially Massachusetts, which is considered a top state in student achievement, and Maine, which we often consider very similar to Vermont.
So I'm happy to get a write-up on each of those for you all. I don't want to try to do it off the top of my head because I'm sure I will miss components of it, but happy to get a write-up for those 2 and the other 2 if you guys want.
I think that would be great too, because having gone through the Massachusetts public school system myself, it has its strengths, but there is also a lot of inequity, whether you're going to school in Andover versus Roxbury versus Springfield versus North Adams. So just want to, watch out for pitfalls.
Senator Hardy, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, well, just one point, the Education Commission of the states, which is, I think, what you all were using it for your comparison, have really good comparisons on their website, so you might check there. And also, just to follow up on Representative Kornheiser, I think it's really important that we have, if we go to some new formula, especially a foundation, because this is what happened in the 90s and what led to Brigham, is that the state underfunded the foundation formula and was not honest about how much it costs to actually fund schools, particularly schools in poorer communities. So whatever kind of protection we were to put in there, it would have to be something that we and future we's could be honest about and actually do. Otherwise, we'll be right back here in 10 years.
Senator Beck?
Yeah, Justin, school construction aid, how is that usually worked in many states that use the foundation formula?
So I would not be here in front of you if I could solve school construction aid nationally. That would be, I could have retired a long time ago. Very few states have school construction aid as part of like really a foundation formula in the base. What they definitely are trying to ensure is that there are dollars for maintenance and operations for your your ongoing maintenance costs, so you don't develop a lot of long-term maintenance issues. But capital construction tends to be done one of 2 ways, and more commonly this first one, which is completely on the back of local taxpayers and local communities. It's not equitable. It's not really sustainable, but it's what most states currently are doing. There are a number of states who are working towards having at least some sort of effort match, so that if a local community does go out for dollars for building, they then get some sort of match from the state to ensure that they can raise a similar amount of money in different communities. I think Vermont, more recently than others, had a somewhat stronger facilities dollars for those facilities, and that has gone away. It's a really tough piece. But again, I think most specifically, you need to make sure the base has good funding within maintenance and operations to ensure you don't get really far behind. And then the state also needs to have capital construction funding to take care of the larger dollar issues that are out there and to build new buildings where needed. And Secretary or Jill, if you guys have something else.
I would love to solve this problem. I think it's exactly that. In my looking through how other states fund this, I haven't really come across anyone who's built it into the foundation formula. It's a separate program. There's certainly decisions to be made, and there's folks in this room that have been working with the administration on an approach. We know that we are not in a good position on this in the state, right? We have the second oldest building portfolio in the nation. We have about a $7 billion hole of deferred maintenance that's replacing in kind. That's not making improvements. And so as we are sort of moving through, a proposal for educational transformation, it's a critical piece. And I think that we need to continue to engage around this. How do we use limited funds and resources to drive towards our strategic goals? And then what are the as we achieve that transformation in those goals, what are the guardrails and what is the resources and support needed so that we are not back in this position 20 years from now? So but I do agree with Justin. We know that our state, I think it won't surprise folks to hear that district budgets chronically underfund maintenance and operations. The national standard is about 3% for M&O. We tend to underfund that. APA is actually doing some really interesting analysis for us right now on understanding, again, it will not surprise us that sort of some of our smaller, older buildings are more expensive when it comes to the percent of M&O. So we're doing some of that analysis as well. But this is a hard nut that we're going to need to crack, but doing it strategically, I think, is really important. And as I said, I think there's folks in this room that have been really great partners on thinking about that. So we do need to, consider it as we're thinking about this bigger transformation.
Representative Holcomb.
Hi, thank you so much for taking the time today to share some of this information. I wonder if you could go back to slide 11. And the last bullet point there says that best practice approach is to set through an adequacy approach, that's evidence-based approach used by Picus and Auden and Associates. And I know that some of those approaches have had pretty rough sledding in the courts. And I wondered if you could speak to that. And my understanding is also that in some of your recent work in Colorado, you actually suggested that a cost factor approach and professional judgment might be a better approach. I'm just trying to have you sort of tie that together for us.
Started talking without unmuting. So I think both the professional judgment, my understanding is both the professional judgment and the evidence base at different times have been approved by state Supreme Courts as acceptable to solve their individual court cases. Now, your court case is not just like every other court case, right? So I am so far from being a lawyer, but so we would want to make sure that piece. So they generally have been accepted to meet, again, those specific needs. In Colorado, where we did land, is we used what the process we go through, again, as we worked with Picus and Auden, and they ran their evidence base separately from our professional judgment approach. We then took a look at the resources from both, and we did a reconciliation based on a number of factors, including a statewide survey that we had done, and then all the information we gained from state educators during the process. And that was hundreds of different educators to say, where would we land? You're right, the number we are recommending is higher than the evidence base, and it's higher than in a couple of key areas. It's higher than that, has some additional mental and behavioral health services for students that don't tend to be in the evidence base. Has some additional system principles. The evidence base doesn't identify system principles at elementary or middle school. We have found both for just teacher evaluations and just good practice for schools. You'd have that. We also identify things like more specials in middle school than the evidence base does. So again, it's a reconciliation between the two. I wouldn't speak for Dr. Picus, Larry, but those adjustments were very similar to adjustments we made in Maryland and in Michigan. So again, a couple of places where just the research hasn't quite kept up with best practice in schools that educators identify.
I just wanted to add one thing, because you had mentioned the cost function as well in Colorado. So just taking a little step back, that there's kind of 4 commonly used adequacy approaches across the country. We've talked a lot about 2 of them, the evidence-based and the professional judgment. The other 2 are successful schools or successful districts and the cost function. And they differ a bit from evidence-based and professional judgment. In evidence-based and professional judgment are really kind of building from the ground up, from a resource approach of identifying what inputs do you need to get to the outcomes that you're hoping for, whereas successful schools and cost function are using your current data, current performance, and attempting to extrapolate out what it would cost at higher performance levels. So I just wanted to name that those were kind of 4 approaches that are out there that are used really nationally and have been, to Justin's point, used both for lawsuits and cases, as well as just the development of systems across the country, both setting their base or setting their weights. So I just wanted to name that the cost function was also used in Colorado. It was not the approach we used. That Colorado actually was unique in that it just had two studies requiring both input-based study, which is what professional judgment or evidence-based would lend it to on identifying those inputs or resources, and then an output-based study, which is like the cost function, and another firm did the cost function in Colorado. So I just wanted to name that there's some different approaches out there and what was going on there.
Your follow-up.
I did. I'd be curious if you've ever worked with the two questions really that follow up. One is, have you ever worked with a state that is seeking to reduce or constrain spending as opposed to one that is trying to raise spending? And then the second question is, there's some interchangeability, and I guess it would be good to have a follow-up conversation on what you mean by student-centric as opposed to school-centric, student-centric versus district-centric, district drivers versus school drivers, because these all have significant impacts in our context, and they really aren't interchangeable. And it is a little hard sometimes to understand what you mean. Just gonna say that. So maybe those are follow-up things for when you come back, but I'd like to know some answer to those questions.
Yeah, so happy to have a deeper dive into kind of those concepts or terms. I would say we generally are not hired in any form to either spend more or less, if that makes sense. So what we're trying to do is if we're doing an adequacy study, is just run those approaches to determine a certain amount, to determine the resources that are needed. I think you're right with most adequacy studies. I think Larry Pike has talked about this even when he put his out. They tend to spend more dollars. They tend to identify the need for more resources than are currently spent. That's kind of been the history of adequacy studies. But again, the approaches themselves are applied consistently as best as possible, place to place.
So I guess my question was, have you ever worked with a state that is seeking to restrain spending?
We have not ever worked with a state who specifically said, we just come in and just restrict spending.
We have, I would say, again, the approaches are intended to be neutral of their outcome. You're not going in with an assumption about what it's going to be. We have worked in Wyoming that was not looking to spend more in their current system. So that was a consideration that they had, but not a driving force in how estimates were created there. If I can kind of clarify the distinction there.
Senator Chittenden.
On that same point, on slide 5, you reference 3 states, Maryland, Nevada, and Tennessee, that recently changed to a foundation formula. I'd be curious, could you elaborate on if they also coupled that with a governance change as well, or if you want to reflect on where they changed from and what their challenges were? We, as part of this conversation, will be discussing our school districts and our school board members, and I'm curious if those other states took that on at the same time of the approach.
Yeah, so I'll take Maryland and Tennessee. Amanda, you can definitely talk Nevada. So Maryland's new funding system is in support of a very large scale, less governance, but really full K-12 system expectation change. And so they have identified a theory of action to what they call getting to a world-class funding system. That world-class funding system was mapped at some level to work done by the National Center for Education on the Economy, which looks at what's going on in places like Singapore and Finland and others. And so Maryland's approach is they have 5 pillars. I won't go through it all, but basically, they're pre-K, redoing their career ladder and the way they pay and implement educators, their college and career readiness, their services for special needs populations, and then just kind of overall structural changes. That's kind of pillar 5. They are implementing their new formula as they implement new parts of their education system. So their funding does change as they put in specific changes to the system. So for example, they had a change in minimum teacher salary. And so funds came in during that year when they're requiring that minimum teacher salary. Tennessee's change, I would say, was much more, they wanted to change from their old formula, which was more of a classic Southern, a little bit more resource formula, and they wanted to go to a foundation formula. They ended up putting more dollars in the system as they did that, but not really based on an adequacy study, much more based on what was available at the time. But so they made a change from a resource system to a foundation formula. And then Nevada, Amanda, I'll let you do that one.
Yeah, and Nevada's change was primarily around changing their funding formula. They hadn't updated theirs in 40 years, and their prior approach was really based on prior spending and comparison between groups of districts that were similar. So they moved to, a foundation formula. Theirs is a little unique. Theirs is the pupil-centered funding plan. So again, everyone uses slightly different student-based, student-centered, but the intent being funding based on student characteristics. And some of the uniqueness in Nevada is that kind of bleeds into the governance is their requirements around how dollars could be used, requirements around how much of the funding had to go down to the school level and how much had to be for their weighted student funding going down to the school level to serve specific students, and then legislation around specific uses of those funds. So theirs did not change their governance structure, but put some guardrails kind of around use of dollars. And I will also name Nevada is a bit unique in their governance from having very small districts to one of the largest districts in the country of over 300,000 students. So I think some of their intention on directing dollars to the school level was to address some of their governance concerns they had in the state without making a governance change, if that makes sense.
And then they also made a big tax policy change. Historically, they left 2/3 of kind of locally generated dollars with the district, regardless of what the formula kind of talked about. All of those dollars have been more like Vermont actually swept into really the full state funding system.
Yes, to address some ongoing equity differences they had between their communities and their local capacity.
Jen Kornheiser.
Don't need to get into this now, but when you come back, would love to hear actually about the differences between the results in those two different modeling exercises in Colorado. Thank you.
Representative Kimball.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is about those states that have implemented the foundation formula where there is local additional funding. What are the sources of that local additional funding? And do you see disparities arising from the ability of those communities to actually raise those additional funds?
So generally those, again, because most states use property tax as one of the big drivers in local funding for education, a lot of those additional funds do come from local property taxes. What dictates the variation tends to be the kind of constraints or guardrails that each state puts on the ability to generate those dollars. So there's kind of two things that you would consider. One would be, is there a cap on how much can be raised additionally locally? So you could say, there no more than 5 or 10% more dollars could be raised above what the state's foundation formula identifies, right? So that's one way you can keep the differences lower. You would still have differences, but you could keep them lower. The second piece, and there's a couple of states who do this pretty well, is that you ensure, again, back to that taxpayer equity piece, which is if a local community would like to raise additional funds, that the state is going to guarantee some level of capacity for a similar rate of effort. And so there are states who do this. Utah is an example, who effectively says, if any community goes out to raise those additional funds, we will guarantee that their wealth looks like, let's say, the statewide average wealth, right? Which takes some state dollars to do that. So there's a couple ways, but you're absolutely right. This is the place, if you had a foundation formula, that you'd have the most questions about inequities in the system, is that kind of additional piece.
So is it typically about 5%, or is it you're just throwing that number out as an example?
I throw it out kind of laughing. That was the original number in Colorado, which is now 25 to 30%, depending what district you are. And that goes back a lot to what I think Senator Kornheiser mentioned earlier, that the state had some funding issues over time. And one of the ways it kind of dealt with that is just to keep increasing that cap. So those who could raise more. And so that's one of the things you just have to really, really concentrate on.
We've been spending a lot of time thinking about what those kind of equalization mechanisms could look like if there was additional spending.
Anybody who hasn't already posed a question? If not, we'll go to Senator Baumgartner.
This may be a little premature. I'm not sure where we are in this process, but for those states that have employed a foundation formula, one of the questions, and you touched on this, is whether the use of those allocated dollars are passive or prescriptive on the part of the state. And is there kind of an average of how states do that, or where are states, some of the states, some examples, or where's that, I don't know, what's the, what are some of the states doing along those lines?
No, absolutely. I think if we go back to kind of the average is that most foundation formulas are still really a block grant to the district, and the districts decide how they would spend them. And historically, if states wanted to target dollars, they've done that through categorical aid. Categorical aid tends to be fully state funded. Again, in Vermont, that's not as much of an issue. In other states, that's a pretty big deal, right? You're taking out local capacity and you're fully funding that through the state. I would say when we look at those states who've done recent changes, including Maryland and Nevada, they've tried to really combine those two approaches. And I'm going to completely mess up, and I apologize. I'm going to throw in more of the student and following the student. But effectively, what both of those states have said is that for those targeted student dollars, and in Nevada, it's really just, I believe, economically disadvantaged in EL, those dollars are expected at some scale to go to the school where the students who generated those dollars reside or being educated. And so, and it's key here is then you have to actually have an accounting system that then can track at probably a program code level those dollars and how they're spent. So again, it's on average is one way. I think there have been some recent changes where policymakers would like to see more alignment between those two pieces.
And Justin, can you talk to, because where the question was really around the funding piece, but connected to that would be policy decisions from the state around how we're defining educational quality and how we're evaluating accountability to that. So there's a lot of decisions that would need to be made within that process to strike that right balance that you're describing, to have the flexibility to customize for your local community while also establishing very consistent standards to ensure that there is an equitable kind of expectation across the state. And so that's kind of the balance we've been talking about in terms of unity and freedom. And what we've been hearing a lot about on our Listen and Learn tour is, really thinking about what are we tight on and those things that are really going to be critical and they're really supportive of student success. We want to make sure that there is more consistency in those areas while still allowing for that customization. So those are a lot of the discussions that we'll need to have around getting that balance correct.
Absolutely. And we always talk about kind of how wide and how narrow are the guardrails. So like in Maryland, there's some general categories of types of services that students can receive with those pots of money. And it's about 75% are expected to be kind of flowing to the school level. Nevada, they're a little bit more prescriptive in the types of services that can go, especially to English language learners. But it's a history based on the fact that they think they've identified some key interventions they think work well with students, so they want to make sure those dollars are being spent in that way. So to your point, there's a lot of variation even within this kind of changed approach to be a little bit more targeted in where and how the dollars are being spent.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to point out that the funding system in and of itself is not the only lever to be able to do those things. Back to the secretary's point about it's the governance and the quality standards that you can then layer on top of that.
Can you expand to, as you're making these decisions, what type of assumptions are baked in and how do you evaluate that to build consensus around what you're funding and also what you're measuring?
Okay. So again, the what is really trying to look at kind of what's needed and the scale, and then trying to really get an understanding of, do you want to be program prescriptive or within a range of program prescriptiveness? So really trying to get how tight do you want to be on the what? Whatever you're dealing with this as a policymaker, right? The more you say the how, the more often someone can kind of come back and say, well, I did that, but wait, it's not working. And so that partly is also thinking about the fidelity of implementation and then really evaluating growth of students, right? With all of this, as you're making changes, you're not always going to see the full results right away. So really thinking through, how do you measure first that implementation fidelity, and then over time, the results that you might get from it. You want to be really thinking through both. spending the dollars wisely, doing the right thing for kids. And it's probably going to take a couple years then to really have an accountability system that can see the results of those changes.
Anybody else? Well, good, this gives us time to meander back to the building. On behalf of my colleagues here at the head of the table, thank you all very much for your time. Justin and Amanda, thank you for coming in, and we look forward to seeing you in person and much more in-depth conversations on this.
Thank you.
This joint hearing stands adjourned.